My parents, Dennis and Sandra Ford, always said the wiring in our old house was too outdated to power more than 3 air conditioners. My sister Beth practiced violin in her room all day, so she needed one. My brother, Monty, had been sickly since childhood and couldn't tolerate the heat, so he needed one, too. The last unit went to my parents' bedroom. I never complained. For 22 sweltering summers in Baddisata City, I made do with an old creaking fan. I thought that if I stayed quiet enough and obedient enough, eventually my family would notice me. Then I borrowed Monty's air-conditioned room for the final online interview with a major company. Right in the middle of it, the door kept opening. Beth singing drifted in from the living room, and Dad stuck his head inside for the 4th time. Still not done. Don't forget to make your brother honey glazed fish tonight. The interviewer frowned.
Sorry.
We don't need employees with an attitude problem. The screen went dark and I sat frozen in the chair, cold sweat dampening my hair. Dad's voice came again from outside. Hurry to the market when you're finished. Fish won't be fresh if you wait. That was when it finally hit me. What I'd lost over the years wasn't just an air conditioner.
Or even a job.
It was my entire family. That evening, everyone sat around the dinner table laughing and trading gossip. No one asked about my interview. No one noticed how badly my hands were shaking. Halfway through dinner, Beth dropped her spoon. It's too hot. I can't eat without air conditioning. I'm going back to my room. Dad immediately stopped her. Don't skip dinner. Take your bowl and eat in your room. It really is hotter this summer. I'll call someone tomorrow and install an AC in the living room, too. Beth's face lit up and Monty clapped happily. I remembered 18 years ago when Dad had told me the wiring is too old. Your room isn't getting an air conditioner. I lowered my eyes. My interview didn't go well today. They said there was too much noise and that I didn't seem serious. Dad placed a piece of fish onto Monty's plate and gave me a distracted. Oh, I couldn't help asking. Didn't I ask everyone several times not to interrupt me? Mom immediately put down her bowl. Are you blaming your father? This is our house. Does he need your permission to walk into a room? If you failed that, it's because you weren't good enough. Don't blame everyone else. My fingers tightened around my spoon. Dad waved it off. One failed interview isn't the end of the world. I already talked to the auto shop down the street. You're strong. You can do hard work. An apprenticeship there suits you. And you'll stay close enough to take care of us later. I started. I spent 4 years earning a college degree.
And you want me to.
But Dad cut me off. His whole face softened as he turned to Monty. You did well this time. Since you're starting college, let's raise your allowance from $15 to $2,000 a month. Monty jumped up in excitement. I lost my appetite. All 4 years of college, my allowance had been $800. Not once had it increased. Last week, when an internship offered me an in-person interview, I'd asked Dad for $100 for the trip. He said money was tight and told me to ask for an online interview instead. He wasn't short on money.
He simply didn't want to spend it on me.
I got up. After 2 steps, Dad called my name, and for one stupid second, hope rose in my chest. Then he said, "Go do the dishes." Something inside me finally snapped, but I forced out, "Okay." After cleaning the kitchen, I took the trash downstairs and dialed a number. "Hello. Is the institute still hiring? I'd like to accept the position." The man on the other end paused. "Didn't you say confidential work would keep you away from home? Too much?" I changed my mind. I'd rather have a good job than come home for the holidays. He laughed. "Glad to have you. Send me your ID information. I'll book your flight. Just remember you'll only get to come home once a year." For the first time, that didn't sound frightening. Baddisata was over 100 degrees outside, yet I almost felt light. I asked the staff, "Dorms have air conditioning?" "Of course. Brand new. Fully furnished." Back in my room, I touched the old fan that had kept me alive through 22 summers. "After I'm gone," I whispered, "you won't have to work so hard anymore." The next morning, I didn't have to cook breakfast. Today was Monty's college send-off dinner, and Dad had gone all out: a private dining room, a flower arch, and a 12-inch 2-tier cake. My Aunt Leanne came over as soon as she saw us. "Your youngest really made you proud." "A 1,260. Which school?" Dad beamed. "Battista University. Top school and close to home. Anywhere farther away, I'd worry." Then Leanne looked at me. "Your second son's graduated, too, hasn't he? Where's he working?" Dad answered casually, "He doesn't have much going for him. Nobody would hire him after his interviews. I had to pull some strings just to get him an apprenticeship at the auto shop nearby." Leanne gave me a disappointed look. "No prospects like that. How's he ever going to find a wife?" I wanted to tell her that I'd scored 1,480 on my SATs. the highest in the state, that I'd held a national merit scholarship every year of college, and won more research competitions than I could count. Instead, I stayed quiet. When my own scores came out, my parents had refused to celebrate because Monty had just started high school. They were afraid he'd feel inferior. My teachers begged them to let me attend a better university, but they insisted I stay close to home and enroll at Bowser State College instead. Now, everyone around the table was praising Monty. He cut a large slice of cake and placed it in front of me. Bro, you always loved cake. Mine's huge. So eat as much as you want. Leanne smiled.
See,
He's always thinking of his brother. You should be more generous with him, too.
you'll need his help someday. Took a bite.
It was painfully sweet. I never had a proper birthday cake. The night before I turned 18, I'd used money from my part-time job to buy a tiny, discounted cake and put it in the refrigerator so we could eat it together. The next day when I woke up, someone had taken it out. In the summer heat, the cream had melted and spoiled. Monty walked out of his air-conditioned room and shrugged. I wanted to chill a watermelon. There wasn't enough room, so I moved your cake. I didn't know it'd go bad. I lost control, pulled out his watermelon, and smashed it on the floor. Dad slapped me across the face. It's just a cake. You can buy another one whenever you want. But everyone else in that house could buy another cake whenever they wanted. I couldn't. So I picked up my ruined birthday cake and ate it. The sour cream made me gag, but I kept eating anyway. That was the first birthday cake I'd ever had. Monty's celebration cake was the second. My eyes burned as I swallowed another bite. Dad noticed and kicked me beneath the table. It's your brother's big day. Why are you making that face? It's bad luck. I tried to hold back the tears, but they came anyway. Dad immediately hissed. Get out. Go home. Don't embarrass me in front of everyone. I stood and left so he could tell when I looked miserable. After all, he just only cared when it embarrassed him. My phone chimed. The institute director had booked my ticket. My flight was tomorrow. I replied with a simple okay. And just like that, the heaviness in my chest eased. And Beth tagged me in the family group chat. Where did you go? Another message followed. Monty got into a fight with our cousin. It's gotten ugly. Get back here and help. I stared at the screen. My tears at dinner were embarrassing. Monty's fight was something the entire family needed to defend. I switched off my phone, returned to my room, and packed everything I owned fit inside one backpack. That evening, Mom, Dad, Beth, and Monty came home. Beth collapsed onto the couch. Where were you all day?
Monty got into it with them.
And the three of us argued for hours before we finally won. I asked, what were they fighting about? They said the mole on Monty's face was bad luck and wanted him to get it removed.
Mom,
Dad, and I were furious. I smiled faintly. Beth, do you remember when I was in first grade and our cousin pinned my head down with his foot and made me eat chicken feed? She blinked. Did that actually happen? I gave a bitter smile. I came crying to you afterward. You told me we were family and there was no point causing trouble. Her face tightened. That was years ago. Why bring it up now? She went back to her room. Mom and Monty left, too. Dad paused at his door. Monty's in a bad mood. Get up an hour early tomorrow and make him those beef hand pies he likes. I tried to say I have things to do tomorrow. I need to pack, but his patience snapped. Lawrence, you're the older brother. Can't you be considerate for once? How long does it take to make some hand pies? Do that first, then handle your own business. Slammed the door. A thin stream of cold air escaped from underneath it. I stood there for a moment, then returned to my room and zipped my backpack shut. The next morning, I still made the hand pies. She stayed in bed. Beth carried her breakfast into her air-conditioned room. Because the living room was too hot, Mom and Dad sat on the couch comparing air conditioner models. Dad smiled at me. Once the living room AC is installed, we'll put a small cot in front of the couch. You'll finally be able to sleep somewhere cool, too. I looked at him. Why can't I have one in my own room? He frowned like the answer should have been obvious. The wiring is too old. It can't handle that many appliances. I nodded. After breakfast, I picked up my backpack. Dad finally noticed. Where are you going? I need to take care of something on Merrill Road. Then I asked if either of you has time. Could you give me a ride? Mom immediately shook her head. I start work at 8. Dad didn't hesitate either. I promised Monty I'd take him shopping. He wants the newest smartphone,
laptop, tablet,
smartwatch, and wireless earbuds. If he wakes up and I'm gone, he'll throw a fit. Okay, I'll go myself. I changed my shoes and walked downstairs. Our neighbor Catherine was sitting in the alley fanning herself. Lawrence, where are you going? I smiled. Off to work. She laughed. Time really flies. I remember when you were tiny, always trailing after your sister and brother.
Now you got a job. Doesn't feel fast to me.
In that cramped room through 22 summers, every day had felt endless. Catherine kept talking. By the way, how was that trip up north? Why weren't you in any of the photos your parents posted? I stopped. What photos? She pulled out her phone. Dad's pinned post showed the four of them smiling together on a family vacation. From a month earlier, the caption read, "A family that plays together stays happy." I stared at the photo. That month, I'd been buried in my thesis defense. My parents had asked exactly when I'd be busy, because they said they were planning a trip. I thought they wanted to find a date when all of us could go. Instead, they'd chosen the exact time I couldn't. I opened my dad's page for my own account and found nothing. Just blank. My fingers trembled slightly. I looked up and smiled at Catherine. I'm not big on photos. I should get going. It's almost time. Talk next time. With that, I turned and walked out of the place I'd lived in for 22 years, backpack on my shoulder. The heat of Baddisata didn't let go easily. It clung to the asphalt, rising in shimmering waves off the highway as the taxi sped toward the airport.
I sat in
the back seat with my worn canvas backpack between my knees. It contained 3 t-shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, my laptop, my college diploma from Bowser State, and a small folder containing my birth certificate and academic transcripts. 22 years of existence condensed into 7 kilograms. When I stepped into the terminal, the blast of central air conditioning hit my
face.
My skin prickled. It was clean, dry, and effortless. I stood beneath the massive vents near the check-in desk for nearly 5 minutes, just breathing. My old phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. A text message from my mother. "Where are you? Your father came back from the store, and you weren't here. Monty wants extra syrup for his pies." I stared at the words. No inquiry about where I was, no suspicion, just a minor administrative complaint about breakfast condiment levels. I didn't reply. Instead, I walked to the nearest trash receptacle, removed the SIM card, snapped it cleanly in half between my thumb and forefinger, and tossed it into the bin along with the plastic tray of the phone. I purchased a cheap, prepaid phone at an airport kiosk using cash I'd saved from tutoring. Underclassmen, activated a new number, and sent a single text to Dr. Harrison Vance, the director of the Avery Thermal Energy Research Institute in Montpelier, Vermont. Boarding now.
See you tonight.
The flight was 3 hours long. Sitting in seat 14B, squeezed between a sleeping businessman and the window, I watched the yellow, parched landscape of the south fade into lush, dark green mountains as we crossed into New England. When the plane landed, the captain announced the local temperature, 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Light rain. Stepping out of the regional airport terminal, the air felt like cold water on a
burn.
I drew a deep breath into my lungs. It didn't burn. It didn't smell like dry dust, melting tarmac, or fried oil from the kitchen below my bedroom window. A quiet, middle-aged man holding a sign with my name was waiting near the baggage claim. "Lawrence Ford?" he asked, extending a firm hand.
I'm Dr. Vance.
"Yes, sir. Thank you for booking the flight." Vance looked at my solitary backpack, then at my face. He was a man with sharp, gray eyes and silver hair, dressed in a sensible wool cardigan despite the
Summer season.
He didn't ask why I had no luggage. He didn't ask why I looked like a man who had spent 48 hours escaping a war zone. "The institute dorms are 5 minutes from the main lab," Vance said as he unlocked his station wagon. "Private room, private bath, dedicated HVAC unit in every unit. We run high-density computing servers downstairs, so the facility temperature is strictly maintained at 66 degrees year-round." 66 degrees, I repeated softly. "If that's too cold, you can turn your thermostat up," Vance offered. "No," I said, looking out the window as the quiet, rain-slicked trees of Vermont blurred past. 66 is perfect. In Baddisata City, the Ford household operated on a precise domestic machinery. For 22 years, I had been the silent gear that kept the rusted motor turning without anyone noticing it was running. When 6 o'clock arrived on the morning after my departure, Dennis Ford walked downstairs in his undershirt, expecting the smell of render beef fat and toasted
dough.
The kitchen was spotless, cold, and dead. The kitchen counters were scrubbed down. The skillet was hung on its hook. The bag of beef patties was still sitting untouched in the freezer. "Lawrence," Dennis called out, his voice reverberating through the hallway. "Where are those pies? Monty's alarm goes off in 20 minutes. Silence answered him. Sandra Ford emerged from the master bedroom, brushing her hair.
He's probably
At the market. He took off yesterday morning carrying that old bag. Catherine said she saw him down in the alley. Taking off without telling anyone? Dennis grumbled, pulling open the refrigerator. Unbelievable. The boy has zero sense of responsibility. He knows. His brother needs to eat properly before we go laptop shopping. An hour passed. Monty stumbled down the stairs, rubbing his eyes, wearing an oversized designer shirt Dennis had bought him the week before. Where's my food? Monty groaned, slumping into a kitchen chair. My stomach hurts. I told you I can't do heavy shopping on an empty stomach. Your brother didn't make it, Sandra said, her brow finally furrowing with a hint of irritation, not concern, but annoyance at an inconvenience. Beth, go. Knock on his door. Tell him to get his rear down here. Beth ambled out of her room, her violin case slung over her shoulder. She kicked Lawrence's door open with the toe of her slipper. The room was empty. It wasn't just unoccupied. It looked stripped. The narrow bed was neatly made, with the thin, faded sheet Dennis had bought from a garage sale 8 years ago. The desk was clear. The closet door stood wide open, showing 6 empty wooden hangers swinging gently in the draft from the hallway. On the nightstand sat the old green plastic fan, its motor housing covered in dust, its rusted blades completely still. He's not in here, Beth called out, walking back to the living room. His stuff is gone. Well, what little trash he had anyway. Dennis stomped up the stairs, Sandra trailing behind him. He stood in the doorway of the small box room, looking at the barren space. What is he playing at? Dennis muttered, his face reddening. Is this a tantrum? Because I told him to go to the auto shop? He thinks he can throw a fit and make us worry? Check his phone, Sandra suggested. Dennis dialed my old number. The number you have dialed is not in service or has been disconnected. He pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at the screen in disbelief. Disconnected? He shut his phone off. He'll be back by dinner, Dennis said scoffingly, turning on his heel.
he
Doesn't have a cent. I gave him $20 3 weeks ago, and he spent it on printer paper for his useless thesis. He has nowhere to go. Let him sit out in the heat for a few hours. When he gets hungry, he'll crawl back and apologize. Right, Sandra agreed, though her eyes lingered for a fraction of a second on the dusty old fan sitting dead on the desk. Let's go. Monty, grab your jacket. We're going to the diner for breakfast. That afternoon, Dennis drove to Miller's Auto Body at the corner of Merrill
Road.
He walked into the grease-scented office expecting to apologize to Arthur Miller, the shop owner, for his son's slight delay. Arthur Miller was sitting behind his metal desk, reading a trade magazine. Arthur, Dennis said, putting on his hearty, local patron tone.
Listen about
My boy Lawrence, he had a little misunderstanding today. Family stuff.
Hill.
Be in tomorrow morning to start the apprenticeship. Arthur Miller lowered his magazine and looked at Dennis over the top of his reading glasses. What are you talking about, Dennis? Lawrence. The apprenticeship. Arthur frowned. Dennis, are you out of your mind? Your boy came by here 3 months ago to drop off some scrap metal he cleared out of your garage. We talked for an hour. That kid holds the highest regional engineering assessment score in this county. He showed me a prototype schematic he drew up for high efficiency heat exchangers. Arthur leaned back, slapping the magazine onto the desk. I told him back then, son, if you ever step foot in my shop looking for a mechanic job, I'll kick your ass out the door myself. You belong in a research lab, not changing oil filters on rusted sedans. What kind of father tries to put a kid like that in a pit? Dennis's throat went dry. He failed his company interviews. He doesn't have options. Failed. Arthur let out a sharp laugh. The director of the Avery Institute in Vermont called me personally last week for a background check on Lawrence.
Said
He was the brightest mind they'd recruited out of the state in 10 years. Offered him a junior fellowship with a starting salary higher than what I make running the shop. Arthur stared hard at Dennis. He didn't tell you? Or did you just not bother to listen? Dennis stood frozen in the greasy light of the auto shop, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. The dorm room at the Avery Institute was 20 feet long by 14 feet wide. It had light oak hardwood floors, a wide desk built from solid maple, a ergonomic leather chair, a queen-sized bed with crisp white linen, and a floor-to-ceiling double-paned window that looked out over the green, pine-forested slopes of the Green Mountains. In the corner of the room, mounted quietly near the ceiling, was an air outlet. It hummed at a frequency so low it was almost imperceptible, a steady, whisper-soft stream of air held precisely at 65 degrees. For the first 3 nights, I couldn't sleep on the bed. I was so accustomed to the damp, heavy heat of my old room, where lying on top of a sheet felt like being suffocated by wet wool, that the softness of a rayal mattress and the chill of the room felt almost alien. On the third night, I pulled the comforter up to my chin. It was thick, heavy, and warm. I lay there under the weight of the blanket, feeling the cold air brushing against my forehead and nose, and for the first time in 22 years, my body didn't feel like an engine on the verge of overheating. I slept 9 uninterrupted hours. Work at the institute began at 8 each morning. My assignment was in the Advanced Thermal Management Group, led by Dr. Vance himself. The project focused on developing closed-loop liquid cooling systems for high-density microreactors, complex thermodynamic physics that required deep mathematical modeling, while other junior fellows took days to decipher the computational fluid dynamic scripts. I worked with a quiet, ferocious speed. For 4 years at Bowser State, while Monty played video games in his air-conditioned bedroom and Beth practiced her scales, I had sat in my stifling box room with a desk lamp burning into my brain, solving theoretical equations simply to distract myself from the heat. By the end of my second month, I had identified 3 critical mathematical flaws in the team's heat dissipation algorithms. Dr. Vance called me into his glass-walled office overlooking the central lab facility. "Lawrence," he said, holding up my review notes. "Where did you learn to run these multi-phase fluid simulations?" "Bowser State doesn't have a computational thermodynamics lab." "They don't," I said simply. "I borrowed the library's access credentials to the MIT Open Course server. I worked through the problem sets at night." Vance looked at me for a long moment. His eyes were kind, but sharp.
Your
"Father, when I called him for your character reference before you arrived, he told me you were academically unsuited for advanced work and suggested I hire a local boy instead." I didn't flinch. "I know. Why did he say that?" "If I succeeded," I said, my voice steady and cold, "there would be no one left at home to cook the food, carry the groceries, fix the plumbing, and take the blame when things went wrong." Vance slowly set the papers down. He leaned back in his chair and adjusted his glasses. "Effective immediately," Vance said, "I'm reclassifying you from junior fellow to assistant research engineer. Your stipend is doubled, effective retroactively to your start date. And I've approved your request for private lab space in Building B." He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a keycard, and slid it across the mahogany table. "Welcome to the team, Lawrence. You aren't in Baddisata anymore." Back in Baddisata, the silence Lawrence left behind rapidly turned into friction. Without Lawrence to wake at 6, clean the floors, manage the laundry, and handle the meal preparations, the household chores fell into chaotic disarray. Sandra worked as an administrative assistant at a local dentist's office.
she
Was used to coming home to a hot dinner, a swept floor, and her washed clothes folded neat on her dresser. Now, she came home to sink filled with dirty dishes, takeout containers rotting on the counter, and Monty complaining about his laundry. "Why hasn't anyone cleaned this?" Sandra snapped one Tuesday evening, throwing her purse onto the kitchen table. Beth looked up from her phone on the sofa. "I had violin practice."
Besides, that was always Lawrence's job.
"Why didn't Dad do it?" "Your father works all day," Sandra yelled. "So do I," Beth shouted back. "And it's 98 degrees in here." The weather in Baddisata had entered the brutal peak of August. True to his word, Dennis had hired a local handyman to install a 3-ton central air conditioning window unit in the living room. It was an old, heavy unit bought secondhand off an online auction. When the handyman installed it, he tapped directly into the living room's existing breaker circuit. "This board is 50 years old, Mr. Ford," the handyman had warned, wiping sweat from his neck. "You've got 3 bedroom ACs running, plus the fridge, plus now this heavy unit. You need to upgrade the main panel to 200 amps, or you're going to blow a fuse, or worse." "It's fine," Dennis had dismissed him impatiently, waving his hand. "We've lived here 20 years without an issue. Just wire it up." That night, for the first time, all 4 air conditioners were turned on simultaneously. Beth's room, Monty's room, Dennis and Sandra's room, and the big living room unit. At 2:15 a.m., a sharp pop resonated through the house, followed by a low, buzzing hum inside the walls. Then, total dark. Total silence. The sudden death of the air conditioners woke the house. Within 10 minutes, the trapped ambient heat of the summer night seeped back into the rooms like boiling water pouring into an empty tub. Dennis stumbled out to the hallway in his underwear, flashlight in hand.
What
Happened? It turned off. Monty screamed from his room, slamming his door open.
Dad.
It's burning in here. My AC went out. Fix it. Calm down, Dennis yelled, opening the basement door and marching down to the breaker panel. The box smelled of burnt copper and scorched plastic. The main breaker lever was melted solid into its housing. The main copper lead had overheated, scorching the wooden beam behind the panel into black charcoal. The house was dark. The house was hot. And fixing it would require complete panel replacement costing upwards of $4,000, money Dennis didn't
Have.
because 2 weeks earlier, Dennis had transferred $3,000 to Monty's checking account to buy his new laptop, gaming system, and high-end smartphone for college. Call Lawrence, Sandra hissed from the top of the basement stairs, her voice laced with sweat and panic. He knows how to fix electrical boxes. He fixed the water heater last winter. His phone is disconnected, I told you, Dennis roared, his face slick with sweat in the beam of his flashlight. Then go to his room. Find his documents. He must have left an address or a phone number for that institute. They rushed into Lawrence's former bedroom. Dennis tore open the small desk.
Drawers.
Empty. Sandra searched under the mattress. Nothing. Beth picked up the dusty plastic fan sitting on the nightstand, turning it over. In frustration. Attached to the base with a piece of yellowing tape was a handwritten note Lawrence had taped there 3 years ago. Circuit 3 overload limit, 12 amps. Do not run high-draw appliances. Simultaneously, Dennis stared at the neat, precise handwriting on the yellowed tape. Lawrence had known. He had calculated the electrical limits of the house years ago. He had kept his own room hot for 22 years, not just because they refused to buy him a unit, but because he knew that if he plugged one in, the fragile, outdated panel his father refused to fix would melt down. He had stayed in the dark and heat, so they could live in the cold. And now he was gone. A year passed. At the Avery Institute, time moved in clean, measurable cycles. I lived frugally. My salary as an assistant research engineer was $82,000 a year. With my subsidized research dorm costing next to nothing, my bank account grew steadily. I bought 3 tailored suits. I bought a high-performance workstation for my private laboratory. I bought books, dozens of engineering texts I had previously only been able to read via low-resolution PDFs downloaded on university computers. Every month, I took $50 and bought a small, high-end pastry from a local French bakery in Montpelier.
Elementart, adzik chocolate gâteau. Millefil.
I sat by the wide window of my air-conditioned room, overlooking the crisp green slopes, and ate it slowly with a silver fork. I never missed a crumb. In September of my second year, Dr. Vance submitted our team's paper on non-equilibrium fluid dynamics in microchannel heat exchangers to the International Thermal Engineering Journal. I was listed as the primary co-author. The paper won the prestigious Young Innovator Award from the National Science Council, an honor that carried a $20,000 honorarium and a keynote presentation slot at the annual Energy Summit in Chicago. The news was picked up by regional academic journals, science trade publications, and eventually the online alumni network of Bowser State College. In Baddisata, things were not going well. Monty's first year at Battista University had been a disaster. And used to discipline, stripped of Lawrence's silent academic assistance, Lawrence had secretly edited and rewritten every major high school essay Monty had ever submitted. Monty flunked 3 core courses in his first semester. His $2,000 monthly allowance disappeared into online gaming, designer clothes, and late-night parties. When Dennis tried to reduce the allowance back to $500, Monty threw a screaming fit, threatening to drop out entirely. He's fragile, Sandra had argued tearfully with Dennis in their muggy, fan-cooled living room. They had managed to pay a local electrician to install a temporary, low-capacity breaker box, but they could now only run one air conditioner at a time, meaning the family rotated who got to cool their room each night. If he drops out, his life is ruined. We have to support him. To cover Monty's expenses and the ongoing electrical repairs, Dennis had taken out a secondary home equity loan. Then came the afternoon. Aunt Leanne came over for tea. Leanne walked into the muggy living room, fanning herself with a magazine. Dennis, Sandra, my goodness, it's sweltering in here. Why don't you turn on the window unit? The panel can't handle it with the fridge running, Dennis said grumpily, sitting in his armchair with his shirt unbuttoned. What brings you by? Leanne pulled out her smartphone, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and thinly veiled malice. Have you seen this? My daughter sent it to me. It was posted on the Bowser State alumni page. She slid the phone across the glass coffee table. Dennis picked it up. Sandra leaned over his shoulder. On the screen was a high-resolution photograph of me. I was standing at a podium in a dark gray tailored suit, holding a silver trophy, shaped like a geometric heat flame. The caption read, Bowser State alumnus Lawrence Ford wins National Young Innovator Award. Former Baddisata resident Lawrence Ford, now lead engineer at the Avery Thermal Institute, receives $20,000 national grant for breakthroughs in cooling architecture. Ford graduated summa cum laude from Bowser State while self-funding his research. Below the article was a list of my credentials: National Merit Scholar, lead researcher, annual salary and grants exceeding $120,000. Sandra gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Lawrence, $120,000. Dennis's face went pale, then flushed a dark, angry purple. Lead engineer?
In Vermont?
He's been in Vermont this whole time. Wait, Leanne said, her eyebrows arched. You didn't know? Dennis, you told everyone at the family dinner 2 years ago that he was working as an apprentice at Arthur Miller's auto shop. Dennis gripped the phone so hard the plastic case squeaked. He lied to us. He abandoned his family to go live in luxury up north while his brother is struggling through college. Dennis, Sandra whispered, her voice trembling, not with anger, but with a sudden, sharp realization. He has money. He has a real position. He can pay off the home equity loan. He can pay for Monty's tuition. He owes us, Dennis growled, standing up, his chest heaving under his sweaty undershirt. We raised him for 22 years. We put a roof over his head. We fed him. And he sneaks away like a thief in the night? How do we find him? Sandra asked desperately. Leanne pointed at the screen. The article says he's giving the keynote speech at the National Energy Summit in Chicago next Friday. It's open to the public. Dennis looked at the picture of his second son, the quiet, compliant boy who used to stand in front of a scorching stove flipping hand pies without a word of complaint. Get the car ready, Dennis said coldly. We're going to Chicago. The Grand Hyatt Ballroom in downtown Chicago was cooled to a crisp 64 degrees. Crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceiling, illuminating hundreds of scientists, corporate executives, venture capitalists, and media representatives gathered for the 28th Annual Thermal Management Expo. I stood behind the stage curtain, checking my tie in the mirror. I wore a charcoal Italian wool suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark blue silk tie. My hair was neatly trimmed. My hands were perfectly still. Dr. Vance stepped up beside me, patting my shoulder. 10 minutes, Lawrence. The Secretary of Energy is sitting in the second row. You ready? Ready, I said. Down in the main lobby outside the ballroom, a commotion was brewing at the registration desk. I tell you, I'm his father. Dennis Ford's voice boomed across the marble floor. Dennis was wearing his old church suit, a ill-fitting navy coat that smelled faintly of mothballs and sweat. Beside him stood Sandra, dressed in an old floral dress, her makeup slightly smeared from the humid walk from the budget hotel 3 blocks away. Behind them were Beth, clutching her purse defensively, and Monty, who was staring at his phone with an annoyed expression. Sir, this is a ticketed professional conference, the young woman at the desk said politely but firmly. If your name is not on the guest list, I cannot issue pass badges. He's my son, Dennis shouted, slamming his palm on the desk. Lawrence Ford. He's the speaker. You think he's going to turn his own mother and father away? What's the trouble here? A tall man in a dark suit with a security earpiece stepped forward. It was the director of event security. These people claim to be family of Mr. Ford, the keynote speaker, the receptionist explained. They don't have passes. The security director looked at Dennis, taking in the wrinkled suit, the aggressive posture, the sweating forehead. He had seen enough estranged family drama at high-profile events to recognize the signs immediately. Wait here, the security chief said. He tapped his earpiece and spoke softly into his mic. Dr. Vance? We have 4 individuals in the lobby claiming to be Lawrence Ford's family. Names: Dennis, Sandra, Beth, and Monty Ford. How do you want to handle this? Behind the curtain, Dr. Vance tapped my arm and handed me his earpiece.
It's
Security. It's them. I took the small earpiece and held it to my ear. Lawrence. The security chief's voice came through. They're making a scene in the lobby. Do you want me to have local police escort them off the property? I stood still for 3 seconds. The cool air from the stage vents blew softly against my face. No, I said, my voice calm, even and entirely devoid of emotion. Give them guest passes for the front row. Let them sit down. Copy that. 5 minutes later, the Ford family was escorted down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. Dennis walked with his chin pushed out, looking around at the vaulted ceiling and the wealthy attendees in tailor-made suits, a smug look of pride returning to his face. See. Dennis whispered loudly to Sandra as they sat down in the front row, directly beneath the main stage speakers. I told you. He knows who gave him his
life.
He knows his place. The lights dimmed. The announcer's voice echoed through the high-grade audio system. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome our keynote speaker and recipient of the 2026 Young Innovator Award, lead engineer Lawrence Ford. The room broke into applause. I walked out from behind the curtain, stepping up to the center podium. The bright white spotlight hit me, casting a long shadow behind me on the projection
screen.
I looked down at the front row. Dennis was grinning, gesturing to the people sitting next to him, mouthing, "That's my son." Sandra was looking at my suit, her eyes glittering with calculation. Monty was slouching, looking bored, tapping his foot. Beth was staring at me with a strange, uncomfortable flicker of realization in her eyes. I adjusted the microphone. I didn't look at my notes. "Thank you," I began, my voice clear and resonance filling the vast hall. "Today, I am presenting our paper on microchannel dynamic heat management.
But
Before I dive into the thermodynamics equations, I want to talk about a concept that every thermal engineer understands: heat capacity and thermal stress." The audience settled into silence. In physics, I continued, looking directly down at Dennis, a material subjected to constant, unyielding thermal stress will eventually reach a critical failure point. If that material is weak, it snaps quickly. If it is strong, it absorbs the energy, hides the deformation, and remains functional until it doesn't. Dennis's grin slowly faded. "For 22 years, I said, my voice dropping an octave, ringing through the crystal chandeliers, I lived in a small house in Baddisata City. In that house, there were 4 air conditioners. One for my sister, so she could practice her violin in comfort. One for my brother, because he couldn't tolerate the heat. One for my parents. And for me, there was a rusted green plastic fan." A quiet rustle went through the audience. Several executives turned to look at the family sitting in the front row. I was told, I continued, that the wiring in the house was too old to power a 5th unit for my room. I accepted this. I ate spoiled cake on my 18th birthday because my brother needed room in the fridge for a watermelon. I gave up my university choices to go to a local college so my brother wouldn't feel
inferior.
I worked in 70-degree heat with a fever while making meals for a family that didn't know my SAT scores. Sandra's face went white. She shrank back into her seat. "And 2 years ago," I said, "when I had an interview that could change my life, my father walked into my room 4 times to order me to cook fresh fish for my brother. When I lost that opportunity, my father told me I wasn't good enough and tried to force me into an auto repair shop so I would stay close enough to serve them for the rest of my life." The room was deathly quiet now. Hundreds of people were staring at the Ford family in the front row. Dennis stood up abruptly, his face dark red with rage and embarrassment. "Lawrence, that is enough. You come down off that stage right now.
How dare you?
Wash our family business in front of these strangers." I didn't stop. I didn't even raise my voice. "I used to think," I said, looking past Dennis into the dark expanse of the hall, "that if I stayed quiet enough, obedient enough, and endured enough heat, eventually my family would notice me. But materials under extreme stress don't wait to be noticed. They undergo a structural transformation. They freeze.
Or
they leave." I picked up the remote clicker and pressed the button. The massive 30-foot screen behind me lit up with a crisp, blue schematic diagram of our advanced heat exchanger system. "My breakthrough in thermodynamics," I concluded, looking back down at Dennis, with a gaze as cold as black ice, "was inspired by my childhood. I learned how to move heat away from where it destroys and send it into the cold vacuum where It belongs. I paused, looking Dennis straight in the eye. Security, please clear the front row. Their presence is interrupting the presentation. Two security guards stepped forward instantly, catching Dennis by the arms as he began to roar and thrash. Get your hands off me, Dennis screamed, his voice cracking violently in the refined air of the auditorium. I am his father. I paid for his life. Lawrence, you ungrateful little bastard. You owe us. Sandra was crying now, clutching Beth's arm, trying to hide her face as camera flashes from technical journalists began to pop around the room. Monty looked terrified, pulling his hoodie over his head as attendees pulled out their phones to record the scene. Sir, you need to leave the premises immediately, the security chief said, calmly, wrestling Dennis toward the side exits. As the heavy soundproof doors of the ballroom swung shut behind them, cutting off Dennis's enraged screams, the audience burst into spontaneous, thunderous applause. I turned back to the screen, picked up my pointer, and began my lecture. That evening, after the conference concluded, I sat in the private lounge on the top floor of the Hyatt. The glass wall looked out over the glittering lights of Chicago. Outside, rain tapped against the glass, but inside, the air was warm, quiet, and perfectly conditioned. A soft knock came at the lounge door. Dr. Vance walked in holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. He handed one to me and stood beside me, looking out at the city skyline. They're waiting in the hotel lobby downstairs, Vance said quietly. The police told them they can't enter the private floors, but your father refuses to leave.
Until he talks to you.
I took a sip of the water. It was ice cold, refreshing. He wants to tell me about my brother's tuition, I said. And the house panel. Do you want to see them? Vance asked. One last time? To tell them off.
To
demand an apology. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. For 2 years, I had thought about what I would say if I ever saw them again. I had imagined speeches, arguments, dramatic confrontations where they would finally see their own cruelty and weep with remorse. But standing here now, looking down at the city from 80 stories up, wearing my suit, holding my award, listening to the quiet hum of the climate control, I felt nothing.
no anger, no hatred, no longing.
An apology from Dennis Ford would not unspoil my 18th birthday cake.
It
would not cool the 22 sweltering summers in Baddisata. It held 0 value. No, I said softly. What should I tell security? Vance asked. Tell them, I said, that Mr. Ford has the wrong person. The Lawrence Ford who used to make hand pies and live in their box room died 2 years ago. Vance nodded gently. He reached out, gave my shoulder a firm, supportive squeeze, and walked back out toward the elevators. I turned back to the window. I pulled out my new phone, opened my bank application, and executed a single transfer. I set up an automated, recurring monthly donation of $500 to the Baddisata Youth Science Foundation, a scholarship program for low-income high school students who needed money to take their SAT exams. The beneficiary note read simply, for those who need a way out. I slid the phone back into my pocket. I walked over to the armchair by the corner, picked up my leather-bound notebook, and opened it to a fresh page. I picked up my pen and began drafting the initial design for my next research project, a multi-stage thermal pump, capable of operating in sub-zero environments. In the quiet room, the air conditioner hummed a steady, gentle tune. It was 64 degrees. I leaned back in the chair, took a deep, clear breath, and smiled. The heat was finally gone.